This is the slave narrative of Roberta Manson. Roberta was the wife of Jacob Manson. He also has a slave narrative on my YouTube channel. Her maiden name was Edwards. She was only a slave until she was 2 years old. However, she recalls the stories that her parents told her. Her slave master was Weldon Edwards, and his wife's name was Lucy. Lucy was the mistress. Now, Roberta's father's name was Lannis, and her mother's name was Ellen. Her parents talked about how rough Weldon was. Once he whipped her father so bad they had to grease his back just to get his shirt off. There were 3 overseers. There was a slave who was sick, so the overseers took him out by the orchard, pulled out his tongue, and beat him to death. Jim Trissel was the overseer who killed him, although they all pinned the slave's death on each other. Jim was fired. It wasn't the first time he killed a slave, which is why the other slaves were afraid of him. Jim knocked Roberta's father down because her father cried over another slave that Jim killed. When her father fell, it knocked his hip out of place. They didn't allow prayer meetings, books, paper, or education of any kind. Once the slave owners realized that their slaves would be freed after the Civil War, they treated them worse than ever before. The old men and women slaves who were too old to work were neglected until they died from starvation from being beaten and or burned. Colonel Skipper, a slave owner who lived near Clarksville, Virginia, had over 200 slaves. He was one of the richest men in the South. When his slaves could no longer work, if they were old or sick and he had no use for them, he would put them on the island near the Roanoke River. The river rose for 18 days once, and they all perished. Roberta's mother and father had bad fare, poor clothes, and shoes. The slaves' vegetables were not sifted or cleaned before they were cooked. Her parents said that the more slaves a man had, the worse off the slaves were. Their cabins had dirt floors. They had straw bunks or wheat straws covered with bags. Once a Negro slave, Roberta's mother Ellen, and a slave named Susan all froze to death. The slave master, Weldon Edwards, had a whipping post. He whipped a slave named Jack Edwards to death because Jack went to a nearby plantation to see his sick wife. Jack crawled to the house from the whipping post and died. They broke up a lot of families by selling the parents away from their children. 4 women were sold away from their children at one time. Aunt Millie cried so much that they talked about whipping her, but didn't want marks on her right before she was going to be sold. Despite things being so bad on the plantation, once slaves were freed after the war, it was hard for them to leave because they had nowhere else to go. They had no education and no money. Thank you for telling your story, Aunt Roberta. May you rest in peace. If you'd like to hear more slave narratives, please subscribe and click the notification bell to be notified when they're uploaded. You can also log on to my online bookstore, burksbooks.com, and purchase my ebook that has real pictures of slaves and tells many other slave narratives.